Okay, guys, this is Kara Marks, and we will be interviewing her today. She's an environmental scientist. She's pretty great. um, let's get started. So, where did you go to school, and what led you to get your master's?
I did my undergraduate at a small Division III university in Abilene called McMurray University. It's a little private school. And then I also did my master's at another small Division III private university in Abilene called Hardin-Simmons. I decided to get my master's because there weren't a lot of opportunities for just a regular environmental scientist when I finished my degree. It wasn't a super prevalent industry really at the time. There weren't a lot of firms that were straight environmental science firms or the engineering firms that had aspects of environmental science. And so my original thought was, well, I'll go ahead and get my master's, and then I thought I would go get my PhD at Tulane in toxicology. And then after I finished my master's, I was really, really burned out. And so master's it was, and I just felt like that afforded me more opportunities than just being a regular environmental scientist with an undergrad degree.
Don't all come at me at once. Decide to pursue a career in environmental science?
So I, at the time, was married to a guy that was in the Air Force, and my original plan of action had been to be a physical therapist. So I was at the time majoring in biology, and the school that I went to was small enough that I could minor in theater majoring in biology. And so I was a biology major and a theater minor with the intent of going to physical therapy school. But with him being in the Air Force at that time, there were only 8 physical therapy schools in the state of Texas, and we weren't even sure if we were going to be stationed in Texas, much less near any physical therapy school. And so I had always had kind of an interest in the environmental, just in the environment in general and science and things like that. And so it was, kind of at that point that even though there weren't a lot of firms that had environmental or that were strictly environmental firms, it was starting to kind of be emerging in the market. And so I thought, well, this has always been interesting to me. And one of the things that is kind of cool about environmental science is that it's always changing, it's always evolving. The regulations are always with science, you're learning more and more. And so it's never stagnant, it's never boring. There's always some new concept that you can so that was kind of part of the reason that I ended up doing that.
How do you use biology in your job today?
So as an environmental scientist, a lot of what I do is collecting samples, whether it's soils or waters or other liquids, and trying to identify them. So using analytical tools to figure out what contaminants are in the samples that I collect. And then based on what contaminants we find, using biology to formulate a plan of action on how to clean up those contaminants or how to manage the contaminants in that area would be the main thing.
So since you work for some of the main Texas airports, what exactly do you do for them?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So in our industry, this is maybe kind of a long-winded answer. So at least the way that my firm is set up, there's kind of 2 sides to the environmental coin. There's what we would call the compliance and remediation side, which is going to be things like when there's a fuel spill and you need to clean it up, or if there's contamination in the water, more of kind of what would be termed the dirty side of the business. And then the other side of the environmental business is what would be kind of termed the NEPA side, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And that's like where if someone's going to, say, build a building somewhere, we do an evaluation or an assessment to find out what resources are going to be affected in the area, like if there's a protected wetland that, you know, we need to make sure to avoid with the footprint of the building or things like that. And so that's kind of what we would term the bugs and bunnies side of the business, like protecting endangered species and, you know, things like that. And so when it comes to the things that I do for airports, I kind of term it that it's sort of an inch deep and a mile wide. It's a little bit of everything. I do soil sampling, I do groundwater sampling, I do stormwater management and stormwater sampling. And then if they have a fuel spill, we analyze the samples and tell them how to clean it up, or tell them, you know, if they've scooped out enough of the dirty dirt and it's clean enough for them to go ahead and move forward. But then I also kind of work on the other side of the house as helping with these environmental assessment documents and helping the airports understand, okay, well, if we add 7 gates, like for example, at Hobby Airport in Houston, they're getting ready to add gates there. And so we're looking at what sort of impact that's going to have on the community from a noise position, from an air quality position, from, you know, all the different aspects of that. So a lot of environmental scientists are kind of specialized to either be dirty side or do the bugs and bunnies side. And so with me, I'm kind of a across the board jack of all trades, master of none, where I'm doing a lot of all the different things for them.
So what are some of the common tasks in your job, like the day-to-day type of things?
Okay, so it really kind of depends on the day. There's a lot of days that I write a desk and write reports, and that's not super fun or exciting by any stretch of the imagination, much like, you know, having to write reports for class. But the other side of it is actually being in the field and collecting soil samples or water samples or air samples, you know, working actually out in working with my clients to figure out what situation they have, you know, what regulations apply, how we can help them move forward maybe with their project while still following the regulations, even though maybe they're having an issue. So it's a lot, there's a lot of hand holding involved with clients, but at the same time, you're also kind of helping them understand the science behind what the regulations say and why they have to do it the way that they need to do it in order to be in compliance with the regulations.
Okay, so why is your job important to the community around you?
Well, that's also a good question, because I feel like it depends on kind of where we are politically in the world and our political climate. The previous administration obviously really didn't care for science. They didn't care to, you know, use the regulations that had been put in place to kind of make the planet a better place. And then you've got the current administration who really feels, you know, that that's an important thing that needs to be protected. And so they're kind of trying to bring back some of those policies. On a community level, I feel like being, you know, kind of the boots on the ground enables me to give back and kind of help, you know, communities, you know, whether there's, you know, something that needs to be cleaned up or something, you know, if a building is going to affect a, you know, threatened or endangered species or an area that should be protected. It's things like that that make me feel like that's the important thing about giving back to your community and kind of starting at least as like the boots on the ground and being able to build and contribute in that way. Does that make sense?
What are your most and least favorite parts of your job?
I love being in the field. I don't, well, let me caveat that. I love being in the field when the weather is great. So when it's super freezy outside, and yes, that is totally a scientific term. When it's really cold outside, it's not fun. When it's really hot outside, it's not fun. but give me a day in the field with a drill rig, fall or spring, and I can literally get paid to play in the dirt. I, kind of nerd out. I was telling Addy last night, her eyes kind of glazed over. It was sad. But like, when we're drilling, we're taking like 2-inch cores, and then they're like 5 feet long. And then you can literally see like where the topsoil is and where maybe there was a construction job and they brought in clean fill. And then you can see when you get to the native soil, like that's been there forever. And so that is just, it's fascinating to me. It's just like super fun just to be out and, fresh air, sunshine. It's a good thing. Least favorite part of my job is probably sitting at my desk writing reports. That's not always fun. And even though the reports are helpful to clients, sometimes you've got to get really technical, but if it's a document that is going to be taken in by the general public, you've got to kind of tiptoe that line between making sure that it's technically sound, but also that it's understandable and in layman's terms where Joe off the block can go pick it up and read it and go, oh yeah, I know what they meant by that. So that's not always fun, but it's just part of the job.
What's the coolest project you've ever done in your line of work?
Ooh. So I'm gonna nerd out on you guys for a minute. I know this is shocking because I've kind of been doing it the whole time. But I worked at Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, Texas, in their environmental science department, and was a compliance person there. And we had a situation where we had some fuel tanks that were on one side of a roadway, and then they had lines that ran underneath the roadway to dispensers on the other side of the road, the fuel dispensers, like your regular gas station. We had a situation where after we had a big rain event where there was a kind of a little median area that had dirt in it, and we were seeing soil staining that was happening there, and it would happen after every rain event. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. We'd excavate the dirty soil, we'd put clean soil back in the next time it rained. When everything dried out, you'd see this oily dirt. And when we would pick up the dirt, it smelled like a solvent, almost like gun cleaning oil would be the best way I could describe it. And we couldn't figure out, Air Force bases are sort of notorious for being places that have contamination issues just because there weren't environmental regulations back in the day. And so it's like, hey, Captain, what do you want me to do with this barrel of used oil? I'll just dump it out in the grass. And so, of course, now everyone is like, oh, Lord, no, don't do that at all. But when there weren't regulations to follow, they just did what they had to do. So we thought, well, maybe this is some sort of kind of legacy contamination issue that's just coming back up that we weren't aware of. But it kept happening over and over. And we were kind of like, well, if it was an old contamination issue, then eventually it's going to run out. But it just kept happening. And so we started looking at the fuel tanks thinking, okay, maybe there was a leak somewhere in the fuel tanks. And like they have a statistical inventory that they do to make sure, they have their computers that are making sure that the tanks aren't leaking, and nothing was showing that there was any sort of leak. Nothing was triggering. And so our fuel guys were swearing up and down, there's not a leak, there's not a leak, there's not a leak, there's no way this is a leak. And we were like, but it's coming from somewhere. And we finally went ahead and collected some samples in the soil. And when you've got fuel, one of the analytical processes that you run on that is you're sampling for BTEX, and that's benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. Well, when we got our sample results back, it was all xylene. And so we weren't seeing any of the top three on that. Well, the way that fuel breaks down, and here's my science nerd thing here, is when it breaks down in the environment, the benzene is the first to go, and then your toluene, and then your ethylbenzenes, and xylenes are always the last. They hang around forever. Well, not forever, but longer. And so we had only xylenes there. So we were just really kind of baffled. And so we started just trying to excavate around the fuel lines from the tanks and just in the area and just kind of dig out and see if we could see what was going on. And what ended up happening was we, got to the fuel lines, had them all exposed, had the dirt, scooped back away from it. And all of a sudden, just this tiny, tiny little drop of diesel dripped out of the line. And we were like, well, where did that come from? Did we nick the line? What happened? No, we didn't touch the lines. We were using our hands. Okay. And so it was this, just tiny drop about every 5 minutes of diesel was coming out of the line. So that's what was happening, was there was actually a leak, but because it was so slow, it was breaking down by the time we got rain that pushed it up to the surface, because it was floating on top of the groundwater. As the groundwater level raised with the rainfall, then the oils came up with it. And so that was really cool to kind of solve the mystery, if you will. And so what ended up kind of coming from that is we ended up moving the gas dispensers to be next to the tanks across the road, and built everything all above ground so that if there was ever another issue in the future, it would be able to be visually seen without having to dig down in the dirt and excavate and all of that. So that was, okay. So the question was, does having the Edwards Aquifer affect any aspects of my job? And the answer is yes, absolutely it does. I'm not sure how familiar y'all are with aquifers and kind of the way that it works, but the recharge zone, any rain or waters that fall within that zone, that's what actually flows into the aquifer. And so anytime that we do work in those areas, whether it's a construction job or anything like that, we have to take extra precautions to make sure that we're kind of managing any stormwater or rainfall that happens on that job site, so that way it's not going to flow into the aquifer and contaminate the aquifer.
So last question, as a female in a male dominated industry, how do you manage that?
So that's a really, really good question. There's a couple of different aspects of being a woman in STEM and, very much being in a male dominated industry. One of the things that, immediately comes to mind is just if I am working on a construction site, just the lack of clothing available in women's sizes. So I've got to have maybe high visibility clothing on. I've maybe got to have flame retardant clothing on. And I have to buy men's clothes and just buy smaller sizes, but they still don't fit. And so when I'm supposed to be the boss on a job site, and I look like I dressed up in my dad's closet in his old flannel because I don't have, things that actually are tailored to fit a woman. And then kind of playing off of that, so many times I'll be on a job site and I will be the manager or the supervisor on the site. And someone will come up and speak to maybe our drill crew and say, hey, we need to ask you what's going on or what's happening out here. And they'll say, we'll talk to the boss. And the person immediately just automatically looks for a dude, because how many chicks are behind a drill rig, honestly. And so just that aspect of it, and, kind of playing on that same thing. If I need to go collect samples, say at a construction site, it's, every time I walk up and ask for the supervisor, they're like, what do you want? What are you going to hold up our schedule? Because I'm asking them to stop working for a minute just so I can collect some soil samples. So there's kind of that whole aspect of it, but then there's other that are just, basic needs aspects, in that, you've got porta potties on site. Dudes get 2 ways to use a porta potty. They can stand up or sit down. We have to just use what we can use. And, the facilities aren't always really tailored to women's needs, you know, while you're out in the field. So it's just kind of a broad across the board women in STEM issue. I mean, you know, the other part of that is working for my firm, which my firm's amazing. But if you look at our ownership percentage, I think maybe 17 of our, you know, 45 or 50 owners in our firm are women. And so, you know, I don't know what the demographics are across our entire employment, but, you know, it's just when it comes to having leadership, you know, female leadership in roles that can help, you know, with the kind of lower level employees, it's always a challenge to kind of be able to explain yourself in a way that doesn't come across as, you know, particularly girly, or, you know, you want to try to just be as professional as possible, but my level of professional may not be viewed as the same level of professional if a male said the same thing. Does that kind of make sense? I feel like I rambled, sorry.
I wanted to ask one more question, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask, like, how would you recommend your job to like kids in college that are like kind of trying to go towards this, or even high school students who have never heard of an environmental scientist? How would you
I would say, like, as a description for my job, I always joke that I'm a professional tree hugger and I get paid to play in the dirt. I mean, but I obviously am not actually out hugging trees every day. But you know, if you want to go into environmental science, I would say that there's a lot of different ways that you can contribute as an environmental scientist. You know, you can be a geologist or a fluvial geomorphologist, or, you know, just a regular old biologist. You can specialize and be somebody who works specifically with trees as an arborist, or maybe you're really interested in wetlands and the protection of wetlands, and so you can become certified to become a wetland biologist. So there's kind of that whole professional aspect of it. And then there's also, we always need people that are able to just go, you know, pick up maybe drums of, you know, waste that's contaminated and need to be disposed of. You know, so I mean, everything from just needing drivers and things like that. So I mean, obviously the job that I do, it's, I mean, you can really kind of take it in whatever direction you want. It's a very broad field. You know, I mean, you think about, I mean, I work for a small engineering firm, but I could just as easily work for some place like SpaceX. I mean, they have environmental scientists on staff because they've got to make sure that the fuel that they're using is being contained properly. And, you know, specifically like down at Boca Chica where they are, they're next to the ocean. So if they have a fuel spill down there, it's a catastrophe. Whereas if you have a fuel spill in Waco, Texas, it's not as much because you're landlocked. So, I mean, there's just like lots of really cool things you can do.
Okay, I think that was
Is that it?
our last question. So
Awesome.
thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you so much for letting us
Oh,
in this whole
happy-
experience.
Thank you for
Happy to.
This was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank y'all.
thank
Let me
you.
know if you have any questions or anything. Addy has my email address. I'm happy to answer any other follow-ups that may not have necessarily come up on the video. So